Here's a famous scene from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. This has probably become one of the most famous and iconic scenes in all of cinematic history, let alone within the horror genre.
And I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in.
But this sort of impact with audiences seemed to be the exception, not the rule with horror cinema. So much so that The Guardian writer Steve Rose has coined a term for horror cinema pushing boundaries and doing something original. He calls it post-horror. Before I attempt to break down this contemporary expression, I think it's important to acknowledge the history that has led to Steve Rose's dilemma. Horror in film has been around since the very beginning, and it's been innovating and original for much of that time too, with German expressionist filmmakers finding creative solutions for very real practical film problems. Artificial lighting is expensive and hard to come by. Use the shadows instead to highlight the frame. The nation feels isolated and cut off from the rest of the world. So do your protagonists. And this freedom for expression within the genre comes as no surprise when considering that horror, as Rose puts it, is somewhere we can explore our mortal and societal fears. With this in mind, it might not be immediately clear how a genre so fluid had become so stagnant. Following Professor Thomas Schutz's work on genre, he breaks it down into an evolution with 4 stages in a cycle. Initially, we have the innovation stage, where filmmakers like Murnau lay the foundations for conventions within the genre, for content and form. Next, the classical phase, where the conventions and tropes had become solidified through excellent execution.
Stay away from me! Wendy! Stay away! Darling! Light of my life! I'm not gonna hurt you. You didn't let me finish my sentence. I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains in. I'm gonna bash them right the fuck in.
Stay away from me! Don't hurt me!
I'm not gonna hurt you.
In the case of content for horror, paranormal monsters, ghosts, zombies, vampires, and otherworldly creatures became commonplace. As did a predictable narrative structure, like the final girl surviving the ordeal, or a discreet private setting becoming an isolated nightmare with no one around to help.
The nearest house is across the lake. It's total privacy.
In terms of form, camera work and lighting spearheaded the genre, with the evolution of things like jump scares, whether it's cutting, panning, or whatever this is. Horror scoring also developed a distinct sound intended to unnerve audiences and build a palpable tension. Unfortunately, it was probably the effectiveness of these features that led to the genre becoming so saturated, with a monopoly being generated for content and form within horror. This inevitably resulted in predictable franchising, where increasing amounts of filmmakers could only rely on visual spectacle to up the game. Here's a good example. So in 2011, John Carpenter's The Thing was remade. But back when it was released in 1981, those conventions in horror that I mentioned earlier, like an otherworldly creature, or an extremely isolated setting, these conventions were only really starting to become classical features. So in 2011, when the film is essentially remade shot for shot, the result is a stale, unnecessary, and predictable remake of what had become a cult classic.
And if you were all these things, then you just attack me right now. So some of you are still human. This thing doesn't want to show itself. It wants to hide inside an imitation. It'll fight if it has to, but it's vulnerable out in the open.
Could be any of us.
We've got to get out of here.
Yeah, right now.
And you could be getting in a vehicle with it. You'd be alone. Vulnerable.
Next on Schutz's genre cycle was the parody. And this was a phase where filmmakers and audiences had become acutely aware of just how tunnel-visioned the genre had become. So those staple narrative features, vampires, ghosts, zombies...
Don't say that. What? That? What? That? The Z word. Don't say it. Why not? Because it's ridiculous. All right. Are there any out there, though? Can't see any. Maybe it's not as bad as all that. Oh, no, there they are.
They become prime targets for parody because of how familiar we all are with them. Horror seems to lend itself to a comedy parody exceptionally well, mainly due to the stark differences between the two.
I don't know if you know this. White people love making people sex slaves and shit.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're not a kinky sex family, dog.
Look, Jeffrey Dahmer was eating the shit out of niggas' heads, okay? But that was after he fucked the heads. Do you think they saw that shit coming? Hell no. Okay? They was coming over there like, oh, I guess I'ma just suck a little dick, maybe jiggle some balls and shit. No, they didn't get a chance to jiggle shit because their head was off their fucking body. Yeah, they still sucked the dick, but without their heads. It was fucking weird, detached head shit. You know, that's Jeffrey Dahmer business.
And finally, the last phase in the cycle is the deconstruction phase, where films begin to challenge their generic elements, like breaking down, adjusting, or reformulating recognized conventions. And all this brings us back to Steve Rowe's post-horror, where in his eyes, the deconstruction phase has come in the forms of filmmakers straying beyond the cast-iron conventions, as he puts it. Rose is more concerned with strong original plots, whose narrative comes from a thematic source rather than a generic one, whose horror content is made more impactful, more horrific by conventions of the genre, rather than simply existing to get these conventions out there on screen. When it comes to post-horror, Jordan Peele's Get Out seems to be topping most lists, and I don't think it's because the film turns its back on classical horror conventions, because it absolutely doesn't.
I mean, I told you not to go in that house.
It's because Jordan Peele's meticulous deconstructive approach to specific elements, combined with a cultural context on something like race in the United States, lets him mirror the world he wants to show within horror, using those cast-iron conventions.
You know, it was all about boiling my influences into like this soup, and you can definitely see it, but Stepford Wives, Rosemary's Baby, The Shining, Halloween, Silence of the Lambs.
Another contemporary example is David Lowery's A Ghost Story. And this is an unusual one, because when watching the film, it's about as far from horror as you can get. Any association with traditional horror cinema seems to be projected onto the film by audiences, rather than the film itself, which, given the film's title, and the homogenization of the content within traditional horror, one could almost understand where confused audiences were coming from. Lowery's A Ghost Story is the perfect example of a film operating within the space of Schutz's Reformation stage in the cycle of genre, taking predictable narrative features, like a haunted house, and taking it somewhere completely new.
And it gives everyone a little bit of hope. Mankind's on the verge of being wiped out, but it keeps going a little bit longer because someone hears someone else hum a melody in a cave, and the physics of it in their ear make them feel something other than fear or hunger or hate, and mankind carries on, and civilization gets back on track. And now you're thinking you're gonna finish that book.
Given all this information, Steve Rowe's perspective on post-horror is understandable. While yes, horror has been one of the most visually evident of a cinema dominated by tropes, cliches, remakes, and predictable narratives, but the films that fit within Steve Rowe's definition of a post-horror aren't new, and they've always had a place within horror cinema, and probably always will.